As a resident of Turf Island, transphobic rhetoric is a daily force in my life. It is effectively the cultural standard here. Any given media or political entity which isn't explicitly run by or in service of queer people and the queer community engages in it on a daily basis. The only mainstream political party free of it in the recent Scottish election was the Green Party, which also happened to be the furthest left-wing party to not be transphobic. The British Communist Party was apparently perfectly happy to broadcast actual TERF bullshit right on their website. Today, I will be discussing one specific example of this in detail. An opinion piece on LGBT rights by Guardian columnist Sonia Soda. She describes herself as an anti-racist in the piece, implying that she generally focuses on issues of race and general equality. This is reflective of her career, in which she has found herself head of the capabilities programme at Demos, head of policy and strategy at the Dartington Social Research Unit, senior advisor to Ed Miliband during his tenure as leader of the opposition, head of public services at Which, and now chief leader writer at The Observer and deputy opinion editor at The Guardian. Like anyone with such an influential career, it was handed to her. She went to a private school as a child and Oxford as a student. I believe it is important to keep in mind this aspect of her background when looking at her writings, as it betrays a relatively privileged perspective. In recent weeks, the TERF collective of Great Blighty have coordinated against the country's greatest queer front. While Stonewall has had a shaky history with trans people, famously honouring TERF journalists in 2007 and 2010, the 2010s saw it shake up and switch angles, becoming more supportive of all queer people, and not just the cis ones. As you can imagine, this shake-up proved somewhat unpopular with the TERF crowd, and this has culminated recently with the Chief Equalities Minister of the current Tory government, Liz Truss, publicly denouncing Stonewall on account of its stance on trans rights, and having the Equality and Human Rights Commission withdraw from its Diversity Champions programme. This has snowballed into a coordinated attack on Stonewall by the UK media. Which brings us to Stonewall risks all it has fought for in accusing those who disagree with it of hate speech. This piece by the aforementioned Sonia Soda attempts to frame the attacks on Stonewall as a righteous rebuttal to a misogynistic assault on sex-based rights by a former bastion for equality. While this piece is not unique, in fact it belongs to a venerable lineage of reactionary anti-queer propaganda dating back to the era of Section 28, I believe it is important before we start to make sure you understand how commonplace this rhetoric is in popular media. There isn't a single publication which does things any better. In fact, this piece is probably the least transphobic article about this stuff I've seen from the UK press in months. Of course, that says a lot more about the UK press than it does about this article. As it stands, this article provides an anatomy for the mainstream gender critical movement's rhetoric, so I believe it's appropriate to run through the piece, dissecting it and pointing out what it is which Soda does to construct a narrative and justify gender critical beliefs. Soda opens with a description of Nancy Kelly, current chief executive of Stonewall UK, comparing gender-critical feminism to anti-Semitism. This comparison ain't anything new. The trans community noticed the similarity years ago, but as Kelly is more high-profile than random queer Twitter users, this was likely the first time many TERFs actually heard the comparison. Unsurprisingly, they weren't pleased, with two of Stonewall's founders accusing the charity of losing its way. As we've already established, the charity used to be relatively trans-hostile, so this stance is understandable, but I'm reminded of the ex-Greenpeace founder who now denies climate change. Association with a positive public entity doesn't make you right about social issues. Soda here also points out an incident with the University of Essex getting in trouble for no platforming two gender-critical academics. This incident started a discourse, both rhetorical and legal, in regards to whether or not this constituted a violation of free speech. In accordance with laws created within the last year, it does legally qualify as such a violation, and thus this decision was rolled back. University of Essex made the decision originally as a result of their participation in the Stonewall Diversity Champions scheme. So depending on how you read this incident, it can become an indictment of anti-free speech policy. Of course, a more reasonable reading will have you puzzled at why the government seemingly has never heard of the paradox of intolerance. The government, or rather in this case Liz Truss, is so invested in this battle against Stonewall that she's trying to get the entire government to withdraw from the Diversity Champions scheme. Sauda points this out, tacitly endorsing the move in context with the rest of the piece, before moving on to clearly stating that she, as a gender-critical feminist, believes that Stonewall, quote-unquote, poses a risk to women, or rather, quote-unquote, many gender-critical feminists believe that Stonewall, quote-unquote, poses a risk to women. While obviously I don't doubt this to be the case, she avoids explicitly stating these beliefs as her own, instead framing them as the beliefs of a movement which she identifies herself with. This evasion of responsibility for her own rhetoric is commonplace among gender criticals, and on some level doubles as an appeal to a silent majority. After a brief description of the gender reductionist beliefs of the gender critical crowd and an attempt to discredit the voice of the youth in general, Sauda goes on to cite a series of statistics about gender-based domestic abuse and sexual violence in order to justify her gender critical beliefs. While these statistics are true, she frames them as being evidence of sex being a primary factor of misogynistic violence as opposed to gender, framing the artificial male-female binary as being an inherent dichotomy of violence from perpetrator to victim accordingly. The issue is, she never actually backs this up. She states that sex is the primary cause of violence against cisgender women, in spite of violence against transgender women being equivalent or in some cases more severe. By not addressing this, and by not addressing violence against trans women at all, she is engaging in a lie by omission to construct a sex-based explanation for patriarchal violence. She has to do this, as gender-critical beliefs entirely rely on there being a sex-based explanation. She does the same thing again by referencing the case of Karen White, a trans woman who was placed into a female prison and went on to sexually assault fellow inmates. This incident, stated in isolation, may lead one to the conclusion that it is better and safer for everyone involved to place trans women in male prisons in order to keep females safe from the inherent danger of male-bodied people. Sadly, this is just not the case, as for every case like Karen White, there are cases such as Ashley Diamond, whom was placed into a male prison and sexually assaulted more than 14 times. The consequences of placing trans women in male prisons for trans women are not remotely addressed or even acknowledged by Sauda, another lie by omission. Sauda here is constructing a narrative in which protections for trans women are portrayed to provide no benefits whatsoever, while harming female, real women. This narrative is designed to lead the reader to the conclusion that protections for trans women are really just windows designed for male-bodied people to abuse females. In reality, these protections are just protections without which trans women, an already vulnerable group, are put in legitimate danger and often subject to chronic and sustained abuse. Next, Sauda outlines the dichotomy between how gender criticals view sex and gender and the reality of sex and gender. Sauda describes, quote-unquote, a clash here with Stonewall's campaign to abolish legal provisions for single-sex spaces so that males who identify as women have the same right to access them as those born female. Sauda also describes the quote-unquote disagreement on what it means to be a woman, whether it is solely based on a feeling or whether it is related to sex. The framing of these issues is fascinating to me. First of all, it implies that gendered support services are even generally based around sex to begin with, which is a questionable assertion at best. Women's Aid, a UK federation of services for female abuse survivors, for example, is explicitly accommodating of transgender women. While some services might be less accepting, those who actually operate with the interests of victims at heart acknowledge that trying to structure these services around sex and not gender does more harm than good. Secondly, Gender Critical's attempts to define womanhood by genitalia is implied here to be the default, being challenged by trans rights activists. In fact, she goes on to say that, quote unquote, the reduction of womanhood to gender expression reinforces regressive gender norms without any backing whatsoever. I, for one, would posit that the reductive stance is that womanhood and patriarchal oppression are entirely defined by a physical aspect which is hidden at all times in public life, as opposed to how you position yourself in the eyes of society and how you express gender identity publicly. This way of thinking reduces gender-based oppression's numerous factors down to a single physical factor. By definition, it's reductive. According to Soda, Stonewall has the power to force gender-critical women into silence through fear and intimidation. Using a rhetorical tactic pulled right from the alt-right, she claims that these issues are being prevented from being discussed by wrongfully accusing those who bring it up of hate speech. Attempts to frame anti-bigotry movements as being opposed to the nebulous concept of free speech, and attempts to decry the concept of hate speech as a weapon used to silence truth speakers is a rhetorical tact which has made its way through practically any bigoted circle with academic representation. From the racists to the Islamophobes, from the misogynists to the homophobes, and from the anti-Semites to the gender criticals. This is a pretty major reason why Nancy Kelly's comparison of gender critical beliefs to anti-Semitism is apt, as they use very similar rhetorical tactics. Nancy Kelly, of course, didn't just compare gender criticals to anti-Semites, but rather bigots as a whole, using anti-Semites as an example. Soda here goes on to list a bunch of beliefs which Stonewall defines as hateful, presumably in hopes that the reader will respond with incredulity. This list is as follows, quote unquote, that there should be restrictions on biological males competing in women's sports, that lesbians can define their attractions as same sex, not same gender, and the High Court's view that children cannot meaningfully consent to puberty blockers. All of these beliefs are in fact hateful. Stonewall is right, and by simply listing them and relying on the reader to just assume that they aren't, Soda manages to avoid having to actually confront any of them. She deftly avoids having to argue that it isn't hateful to exclude trans women from sport in spite of them taking treatment which negates their physical advantages. She avoids having to argue that it isn't hateful for lesbians to claim that their attraction is based on a single physical attribute they literally cannot detect due to the existence of clothes. She avoids having to argue that children are in fact unable to consent to puberty blockers, which is an especially tenuous position to hold, given that you either engage in a double standard or imply that children cannot consent to any medical treatment whatsoever, and thus shouldn't receive any. By this logic, children cannot consent to medication for chronic acne, for example, which if left untreated can cause severe scarring. The medication for chronic acne is far more dangerous than puberty blockers, but you never see anyone claiming kids should be prohibited from acne medication on the basis that they cannot consent to it, because of course you don't. That position is ludicrous. Sada closes off the piece with the following rhetorical flourishes. She goes all in for the old chestnut that civil rights campaigners should have to find compromise and be civil with their oppressors and bigots, that being uncivil generates backlash and halts progress. She tries to leverage her self-proclaimed status as an anti-racist to claim that it's the moral responsibility of progressives and oppressed individuals to engage with individual bigots and oppressors about the finer details of structural discrimination, as opposed to actually combating said discrimination on a societal level. She tries to leverage her self-proclaimed status as an anti-racist to claim that equating gender-critical views with racism is fraudulent on Stonewall's part, and that they are losing the opportunity to win the argument, implying that there's an argument to be won and not oppression to be torn down. She even takes a crack at the concept of white fragility, which she decries as a caricature for the right to use and counterproductive to solidarity building. Yet more rhetoric taken from the alt-right's playbook. Solidarity building with whom exactly, Sonia? Racists? This ending to the piece reminds me that, as we established earlier, Sonia Sada is a privileged private school and Oxford alumni who in her life has held influential positions handed to her by circumstance and plain old luck on a silver platter. When discussing prisons earlier, Sada didn't even for a second entertain the idea that the way we imprison people in general is fundamentally flawed and should be abolished outright. She looked at issues surrounding sexual abuse in prison and thought, we shouldn't fix this, we should just separate people by sex so that it's definitely not a male abusing a female, as opposed to preventing abuse outright. That just didn't occur to her. The way she sees it, society is just fine on the track it's on, and she's reacting to social progress which she doesn't like in order to push back against it. Her piece went to all the stops, going for most if not all of the turf cult's rhetorical tricks. She removed responsibility from herself for her own words by framing them as the will of a group she identified with. She lied by omission to create a narrative in which protections for trans women posed a danger to genuine female women. She falsely implied there was an inherent tension between trans rights activism and female support groups. She tried to flip accusations of sex-based feminism being reductive back on gender-based feminism poorly. She alluded to a powerful group silencing free speech with false accusations of hate speech, and then finally made an appeal to civility. At the end of the day, this piece is just another privileged, upper-class, privately educated, cisgender person engaging in reactionary politics at the expense of a minority group. Nothing more. There's nothing new about this, we've seen it all before, which is what makes it such a perfect anatomy of this entire mindset, and is what makes it so worth dissecting. This article is the UK TERF ideology, crystallised and presented in the most palatable way possible. So if you familiarise yourself with it, you've familiarised yourself with the entire UK TERF movement. And really, that's why I'm here. That's why I've started making YouTube videos, because I saw this and I saw that it was such a really clear and obvious example of everything that they do. So I grabbed my Word document, I grabbed a microphone, and I made this video, and it's finished now, it's over. I'm done. I don't know what the next video will be about. I'll have to wait until I want to make it, but overall, I feel very strongly about this subject, and I hope I've conveyed my response to this article effectively. You can feel free to let me know in the comments if I did that, and if you're interested to see what my next video will be like, you can subscribe, I guess, or don't. I mean, If you don't have a YouTube account and you're just watching this without one, good for you. I have no idea where I'm going with this. My script ended about a minute and a half ago, and I've just been talking, and it's almost 6 o'clock in the morning. I've not slept, so I'm gonna turn this off now. Thanks for watching all the way through. Have a nice night. Bye.